Yep. Right, 14 months ago I published a video here on YouTube about the Welsh Government's proposed changes to speed limits in built-up areas all across Wales, basically reducing them from the statutory 30 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour. That video sort of ran its course at the time. You know, it was busy for 2 or 3 weeks, and then, as usual, it just settled down to mere background views. And then, just after this weekend, views rocketed again. Yesterday, it had 10,000 views. Now, that video had over 1,700 comments on it, and among those comments were a lot of people saying, you know, this is never going to happen, it's ridiculous, there's no way that can happen anywhere in the UK. The Welsh economy would collapse, tourism, which Wales is quite heavily reliant on, would go through the floor, and it would be a complete disaster. Now, I agree with the latter part of that sort of sentiment, but not with the first part. I knew at the time that it was going ahead, and I knew that nothing would stop it. And of course, the reason for the increase in views since this weekend was that last Sunday, these new regulations actually went into force. So what I'd like to say to those people that accuse me of being a far-right nutter in the comments on that video, I'd like to say in return, I think you got your words mixed up. I'm a nutter that's been right so far. Now, in that video, I provided quite a lot of evidence to suggest that this 20 mile an hour speed restriction thing was nothing to do with safety, it was nothing to do with the environment. It was an agenda formulated by the Welsh devolved government to put a stop to personal transport. That's all it's about. It's about control. I also provided some links to various news reports that reported on certain speeches that members of the Welsh Government had made, which made it very, very clear they wanted rid of personal motorised transport. They didn't want people to have that freedom anymore. Now, it doesn't surprise me, but in that 14 months since that video, you know, was uploaded, some of those links have now been removed. I mean, they're there on the video, but when you click on them, the articles have been mysteriously removed. So, please, watch this video to the end, and then click on the information tab, top right hand side of the picture, and go back and watch that video, because I go into, you know, what was said in a lot more detail in that video. Because these new 20 mile an hour restrictions are not the be all and end all. The Welsh Government intends going much further with road tolls and congestion charges to persuade motorists that there's just no point owning your own personal motorised transport anymore. I think they referred to it as a stick and carrot approach. So, back to these 20 mile an hour restrictions. On all roads that were formerly 30 mile an hour zones, the speed limit has now been changed to 20 miles per hour. Now, these are usually rural or built-up areas, villages, towns, which when you put them together amount to a significant mileage across the Welsh roads. Now, I don't have a great problem with 20 mile an hour zones, providing that they're there for a reason and that they're proportionate. You know, outside old people's homes, schools, hospitals, the key danger zones. 30 mile an hour was worked out as being a reasonable speed many, many years ago for built-up areas. It provides a reasonable rate of travel that's good for the economy, whilst minimising accidents, deaths and injuries. It wasn't a perfect formula, nothing ever is, but it was a good compromise that's worked well for decades. Personal motorised transport is the lifeblood of the economy. It gets people to work, it gets people to the shops to buy essential or even non-essential items. It's an essential part of tourism that, you know, allows money to migrate from one area to other regions that rely on tourism. And a country like Wales, which actually covers quite a large area, but only has a population of about 3.25 million people, relies really heavily on tourism. It's a beautiful country, but a lot of it is composed of sort of fairly remote areas where personal motorised transport is essential both for tourism and for local people to be able to move around and do what they need to do to live. Now, as was identified decades ago, slowing down the rate of travel unreasonably affects the economy. It increases travelling time for everything, and the latest estimates are that this is going to cost the Welsh economy between 4.8 and around £9 billion over the next few years. And I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think tourism was even included in those estimates. Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of the Welsh Devolved Government, says that this is going to save the Welsh National Health Service around £92 million a year in the treatment of injuries caused by accidents that would have occurred had the speed limit been left at 30 miles an hour. I'll be honest, I've got no idea where he got those figures from. Now, on the devolved Welsh Government's website on this subject, under the heading of Policy and Strategy, the first bullet point that they give for the reasons for this change is to reduce the number of collisions and severe injuries from them. Also, reducing the impact on the NHS from treating the people who are injured. I mean, that sounds quite compelling, right? You know, put the economy to one side. If it's going to save a large number of lives, it's worth doing, surely. Only, it's unclear to me where he's got that data from, because if you go onto the UK central government's website and look this subject up, they've done an awful lot of research into the impact of 20 mile an hour zones. Now, going on to the UK government's website, a Department of Transport study was set up looking into some holes in the data that were identified in 2014. They wanted a clearer picture as to whether it was worth reducing speed limits from 30 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour. They wanted to get it right. They wanted to know what the facts were. I mean, there's no point buggering up the economy by dropping the speed limits from 30 to 20 if it's not actually going to make any difference. Now, this was a very comprehensive study, and it was finally published in 2018, with a slight revision made in 2019, just as the pandemic hit us. Now, I read bits of it, and I'll be honest, I started losing the will to live, but luckily, at the end, there's a results conclusion, which reads: there is not enough evidence to conclude that there has been a significant change in collisions and casualties following the introduction of 20 mph speed limits in residential areas. Which is a long-winded way of saying that after in-depth studies, they've concluded that changing the speed limits from 30 to 20 mile an hour made no difference. Which is completely at odds with Mr. Drakeford's claims. 12 case studies that all came to the same conclusion. A completely different conclusion that Mr. Drakeford's come to. Now, I think one of the reasons for this is that at 20 miles an hour it becomes problematically difficult to keep the vehicle at that speed. Motor vehicles are not designed to travel everywhere at 20 miles an hour. You're usually in a lower gear, which heightens throttle response. And the effect that that has is that it takes a lot more concentration to keep the vehicle travelling at 20 than it does at higher speeds, like 30 miles an hour. The result being, your average driver spends more time looking at the speedometer than he does looking at the road. In other words, the problems associated with maintaining that speed compromises situational awareness. They're not keeping their eyes on the road. In effect, changing the speed limits from 30 to 20 removes one potential hazard but replaces it with another. And it seems that the Welsh devolved government has decided to sort of leave that bit out of the equation. It seems to me that Mr. Drakeford and his government has manipulated the data in order to suit his particular agenda. I don't think this man particularly cares about the welfare of children, or anyone else for that matter. Don't forget, during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, all non-essential stores across the UK had to close down. Only essential stores were allowed to stay open. Stores like supermarkets. Now, supermarkets don't just sell essential things. They sell toys for children, they sell clothes, they sell books and magazines. They sell cosmetics and personal hygiene products. Things that assist in the welfare of children and adults alike during a period of what basically consisted of about 18 months of house arrest. But Mr. Drakeford didn't want the Welsh people to have access to those sort of things, so he issued an order to all supermarkets that they had to barricade the aisles to toys for children, personal care products, personal hygiene products, books, clothes, kitchen utensils, so that people couldn't get access to them while they were shopping. Now, he used some very similar excuses for this, that, you know, it would minimise the time that people were in the shop, so it would make everyone safer, it was looking after everyone's welfare, and that it would also take the stress off the national health system. No other government in the UK did this or went to that extreme, not even the Scots devolved government, because they realised that these sort of products were a lifeline for people during very difficult times. What Mr. Drakeford was doing basically was exerting control over people. And I formed the opinion right there and then that this man was nothing more than a tin pot dictator exerting control over his own private little fiefdom. The man seems to be drunk on power. Now, initially, when the Welsh Government first mooted 20 mph zones, one of the main sort of driving forces behind it, one of the main reasons that they initially put up, was that this was going to safeguard the environment. It was going to assist with pollution by reducing emissions. Now, there were some major holes in that, so they sort of demoted that to last place. But it's still there among the other sort of pathetic reasons that is put forward, because anybody with an IQ higher than 10 will know that that is complete and utter garbage. It's an outright lie. This is not going to safeguard the environment for future generations. It is going to increase pollution and is potentially hazardous to the health and well-being of people living in Wales. Now, again, in the last video that I made 14 months ago, I actually carried out a test in my own car, and I found that at 30 miles an hour I could hold fifth gear at about 1100 revs, I think it was. But when the speed reduced to 20 miles an hour, when I was going through a 20 mile an hour zone, I had to shift down to third gear because the engine wouldn't handle fourth. It was constantly telling me that I needed to change down to third. Otherwise, long term, allowing the engine to lug would cause engine damage, which increased the revs per minute, and of course, your journey is going to be 1/3 longer. So, emissions were going to increase by between 33% and 40% because of the higher revs. So you're not safeguarding the environment, you're actually pushing environmental damage up. And a recent bit of research from Fairfuel UK suggests that travelling at an arbitrary 20 miles an hour is going to increase nitrogen dioxide output by 136%, which is horrendous, because nitrogen dioxide is thought to be the cause of many major respiratory diseases. Now, please, comments below, tell me how that assists in the health and welfare of the population, because I cannot make that fit with Mr. Drakeford's claims. Now, the Welsh people are understandably distraught by what, the Welsh devolved government has done. I think a lot of them believe that, it would never happen. Eventually, someone would step in to save them, but this whole net zero anti-motorist thing that we're seeing around the UK, no one's going to come and save us. We've got to save ourselves. Because regimes like this don't stop until there's enough resistance to stop them. Now, granted, this is anecdotal, but I have had a number of people reach out to me as a result of that other video that I made in the last few days, expressing their anger and despair over what's going on in Wales at the moment. Among them, a number of elderly people who they're frightened to go out because, well, I mean, the Welsh Government has been quite sort of blunt in saying to people, well, this shouldn't have been a surprise because we've been telling you about this for 4 years, but they haven't got all the speed restrictions in place. There are some roads that are showing 30 mile an hour and 20 mile an hour zones on the same stretch of road. And there are some that are still showing 30 mile an hour, even though on the sort of map on the government website, it's now showing them as 20 mile an hour zones. They've made a complete mess of the transition. So they really don't know what to do. They've cancelled arrangements to visit friends and family. They daren't go to the shops. They're frightened to visit the doctors because they simply don't want to fall into what they consider to be a trap. The entire transition is a shambles. And then, as we've seen in London over the ULEZ expansions, locals are defacing the speed limit signs. Now, I'm not going to condone that kind of behaviour, but I can't really condemn it either, because what the Welsh Government have done simply isn't right. In the video description down below, I'm going to leave a link to a government petition to reverse this draconian speed limit drop. Last time I looked, it had well over 300,000 signatures. Join in and add yours to it. When you consider the size of the Welsh population, 300,000 signatures is massive. And the bigger it gets, the harder it is for Drakeford to ignore it. The man is a mad hatter, a dictator, and historically one thing always happens to dictators. The regimes always come to an abrupt end. Now, there are parallels with other things that are going on in the United Kingdom. ULEZ, Sadiq Khan. Just like Mark Drakeford, he's also a member of the Labour Party, with a central Labour Party government looking very likely to take over in the UK within the next 12 months. I can't help thinking that what we're looking at here are two sort of experiments to see how the public will react when their rights as human beings to travel around freely are abruptly curtailed. Keir Starmer's government in waiting, let's be clear, they're working on very similar agendas for the future. What's happening in Wales and what's happening in London are not isolated occurrences. This is going to spread across the UK. They've been planning it for years, and I believe we are on the brink of losing our freedom of movement. It's closer now than it's ever been. No one's going to save us. We need to save ourselves. Right, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I'd also appreciate it if you would leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. You can support the channel in other ways by signing on to my Patreon page or leaving a super thanks at the super thanks button down below. I am of course going to be back next week, and I will endeavour to make sure that it is motorcycle-y stuff. So until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.